Deputy and also the team across Elections ACT to present today the party and candidate information briefing. The purpose of today is to ensure that as a part of a broad information campaign, parties and candidates are aware of the details of the process of nomination, but also importantly, the obligations surrounding the process of having been nominated or declared candidate for party for this election coming up in October this year. There's a lot to cover, a lot of information. This is the second of such briefings. My Deputy Rose Spence will go through the detail of this, and there'll be opportunities for questions as part of this briefing. This session, as I said, is the second of two sessions. Information on the slides, I should say, the information from this was available via the webinar process, but also here at ACT, always very comfortable that we're able to take your questions. If you're unable to take your questions today for whatever reason, please get hold of the team at electionsact.gov.au and we'll make sure we get back to you with as responses as we can. Without any further delay, noting that we'll be busy lives, I'll pass to Rose Spence, who will walk us through the brief today.
All right. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us. As Damien said, this is a second bit of a repeat of a party and candidate information session we gave back in December, but I think it's quite useful to provide it again now that the party registration period is closed. I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the ACT, the Ngunnawal people, and recognise any other people or families with connection to the lands of the ACT. We acknowledge and respect their continuing culture and the contribution they make to the life of this city. Just a little bit of a disclaimer to begin the presentation today. It's important to note that the advice provided today is based on Elections ACT's analysis of the electoral law. This advice cannot be taken to be formal legal advice, and you may wish to seek your own legal advice in relation to any matter discussed today or may be relevant to you as an electoral participant. A few housekeeping things to kick off. Please use the chat question and answer function to ask questions throughout the session as they arise. I'll pause at times to address the questions that have been lodged. Anyone here with us in the audience today with a question, please hold on to those until those pause times. And for those attending online, please keep your microphones on mute for the duration of the presentation. We're going to cover a considerable amount of complex material today, so it's worth noting that we are recording this presentation and we'll publish it on our website for future viewing. While this presentation does go through a lot of detail, it is important detail for anyone wishing to run as a candidate or maintain a political party. So today we'll cover the important points around nominating as a candidate, how and when, and also the laws around campaigning. I'll provide brief information on changes to the early voting arrangements. We'll go over authorisation of electoral matter, what electoral matter is and how to ensure your material is appropriately authorised, including recent changes to the law. The electoral expenditure cap, when it applies and the dollar amounts. We'll go over gift reporting and the requirement for an election return. We'll discuss donors that you aren't allowed to accept money from. And finally, we'll take some time at the end to answer any more questions from the audience. It's worth pointing out that we'll not be touching on misleading electoral advertising laws as part of this briefing. As this will be the first time these laws have been in place during an ACT election, we're going to be covering those new laws in detail as part of a second briefing, which will follow soon after the conclusion of this presentation today. This briefing is aimed at giving our political participants a foundational understanding of the important information required to run as a candidate or a party, or even to engage as a third-party campaigner in an ACT election. But for more detailed and specific information, we always recommend visiting the Elections ACT website for fact sheets, funding and disclosure manuals, and the candidate information handbook. So those details can be accessed through these channels on your screen now, website, email, or over the phone. And we're always available to provide advice and information, and we welcome any contact to assist you in to wherever we are able to. This contact information is also reflected at the end of this presentation. So, this is some critical information for those individuals wishing to contest the 2024 election as a candidate. Nominations open on the 13th of September and they close at 12 noon on the 24th of September this year. Nomination forms will be made available from the 6th of September. That's the week before nominations open. We don't make the nomination form available before this because a critical element of a nomination form is that it includes the enrolled addresses of people who are nominating and contesting. If we release the form too early and those details are captured, there is potential for those details to be altered by the individual before the nomination period, and this then increases the chances that those individuals are no longer eligible to nominate. So the form won't be available until much closer to the opening of the nomination period. The form will not be provided prior to this date, but it is important to understand that candidates can commence their campaign for election at any time. Candidates do not have to be formally nominated or have their nomination declared by the Electoral Commissioner before they can start campaigning. In theory, candidates could have commenced campaigning for the 2024 election, the 18th of October 2020, which was the day after the most recent election. And I cannot stress this part enough. Do not leave your nomination and the completion of your nomination form to the last moment. If there is a problem with your completed form, it can be fixed or adjusted during the nomination period. That is prior to 12 noon on the 24th of September. But if the form is lodged with issues very close to the nomination close time, and let's say not all of the nominators are eligible to nominate you, and consequently this leaves you short of the required number of nominators, then there may not be time to resolve this issue before 12 noon cutoff. And that is a strict cutoff. So there are two types of candidates that can run in an ACT election. Non-party candidates, also known as independents, and party candidates. To run as a non-party candidate, you will need to be nominated by at least 20 electors who are entitled to vote in the electorate in which you will be contesting. It's worth noting that while the nominators are required to be enrolled in the specific electorate, the candidate themselves does not need to be enrolled in the electorate that they are nominating to contest. For non-party candidates, the nomination form asks the candidate whether they would like to include the word independent underneath their name on the ballot paper. This is a choice that each non-party candidate will need to make at the time of nomination. All non-party candidates are listed on the ballot paper in a column on the right-hand side of the ballot paper, the ungrouped column. Depending on the number of non-party candidates contesting a particular electorate, there may be more than one ungrouped column on a ballot paper. It doesn't happen very often, but it did occur in Ginninderra at the 2016 election. Now, this is the other important thing to remember for all you registered political parties out there. If a registered party only nominates one candidate to contest in an electorate, then the candidate's name will also be included in that ungrouped column. It doesn't matter if they're running lots of candidates in other electorates. If they only nominate a single candidate in one of the electorates, then the candidate will be included in the ungrouped column with the name of the party listed underneath the candidate's name rather than the word independent. For candidates of a registered political party, these candidates can only be nominated by the registered officer of the party or a deputy registered officer if one has been appointed. If the party has not registered a deputy registered officer, then the only person that can nominate candidates is the registered officer. Parties may like to consider the risk of this scenario, particularly thinking of the ACT's current rates of flu and COVID illness. So moving on to the ability to lodge a candidate information statement. The ability to lodge a candidate statement that is published on the Elections ACT website was first introduced at the last election in 2020. The supporting legislation for this remains for the 2024 election, but the timing for lodgement has been altered slightly. Candidate statements can now be provided to Elections ACT from the point of nomination and will be published online soon after the formal declaration of candidates. Each candidate can supply a statement up to a maximum of 500 words, a photograph of the candidate, and information on how to contact the candidate, which could be things like social media accounts, website address, or email accounts. In terms of content, the statement cannot include anything obscene, defamatory, or otherwise unlawful. The Commissioner may decide not to publish any content that does not comply with this part of the legislation. In this scenario, the statement will be published with the offending material omitted. As an example, if the supplied text is 510 words long, the statement will be published up to the 500th word. If this is the case, we will write to you to advise that we will not be publishing particular bits of that content. Only once within 14 days after the publication of the candidate's information can you give the Commissioner revised information. This isn't internal policy, this is legislation. So since the 2020 election, we've developed a web form for the lodgement of candidate information statements. This is our preferred method of lodgement. The link will be made available from our website closer to the formal nomination period. We will also have a fact sheet covering all the necessary information. You can lodge your information and photo via email if you choose, but like I said, our preference is that it's lodged via the web form. The nomination form also provides for a candidate to detail the name that they would prefer to appear on the ballot paper. We call it the ballot paper name. However, the Act is fairly prescriptive on what is and isn't allowed. The candidate's enrolled surname must be printed, along with the enrolled given name or an accepted variation of that enrolled given name. As an alternative, just the given name initial would be included instead of the given name. This is the candidate's choice. But nicknames that are not an accepted variation of the given name cannot be displayed on the ballot paper. So here is a sample ballot paper for the electorate of Yerraby. Candidates' names are listed on the ballot paper in columns. Each party with two or more candidates will have a column with the party name appearing at the top. On the nomination form for a registered political party, the registered officer of the party chooses whether the registered name or the registered abbreviation will be printed on the ballot paper. The ungrouped column is always printed on the right-hand side of the ballot paper. As discussed, non-party candidates will have the option to print the word independent next to their name. This example shows both potential outcomes, the choice to include independent or the choice not to in that right-hand column. As you can see in this sample ballot paper, candidate 4 is listed in the ungrouped column because party 7 only nominated one candidate in this electorate. So moving on to campaigning rules. As mentioned earlier, candidates can commence their campaign at any time, but there are a few laws that a candidate must be aware of. There are laws around authorisation of material and misleading electoral advertising, but we will go into greater detail around authorisation shortly, and the following briefing discusses misleading electoral advertising. So the 100-metre rule. As many people are aware, the rules for the ACT elections are different to federal elections in the ACT. Canvassing for votes of any kind is not permitted within 100 metres of a polling place during the hours of polling. So handing out how to vote cards, placing electoral signs, including corflutes, parking cars with electoral material on them. These are examples of political canvassing that are prohibited within 100 metres of a polling place during the hours of polling, during the hours in which polling is taking place. Closer to the election, Elections ACT will make maps of the polling places with measured 100-metre boundaries around them, and they will be made available on our website. This will allow participants to understand the limitations on where their campaigning activities can take place, and the managers of each polling place will also have that map specific to their location. So there are also laws relating to the placement of signs in public places, although these laws are administered and enforced by Transport Canberra and City Services directly. There is a new limit on the number of movable signs, also known as corflutes, but it also includes A-frames. It's a limit on the number that an individual or an entity is able to display across the ACT. So a candidate or a prospective candidate is allowed up to 250 signs on public unleased land at any given time. The same is true for a political party, 250 signs. That means each candidate in the party is allowed 250 corflute signs, and the party itself is also allowed 250 signs specific to the party. The details of these limitations, including matters of design, placement, duration, safety and insurance, are detailed in Public Unleased Land Movable Signs Code of Practice 2023. I would very much recommend Googling that and updating your own knowledge of the requirements within it. There are infringement penalties associated with breaches of the requirement of that code. Also of note, electoral advertising signs may only be displayed for a period of up to 6 weeks during the 6-week preceding the election and must be removed within 48 hours of the close of polls. City rangers are empowered to remove any sign in breach of the regulations without prior notice, and fines may be involved. The new laws also prohibit movable electoral advertising signs being displayed on or adjacent to roads that have a usual speed limit of 90 kilometres an hour. Also, under the new offence, vehicles with a sign attached that displays electoral matter will not be permitted to park in other designated places as well. I understand that those designated places and associated regulations are quite specific, which I stress are administered and enforced by Transport Canberra and City Services Directorate. I'm informed that that TCCS have developed fact sheets on these specific matters, and we'll make those available. They will be made available on the government website, and we can also provide them to you upon request. So I'll just take a break here and address any of the questions that may have been lodged so far or can be asked now. Nothing so far. Anything in the crowd? No? Fantastic. Yeah, we've got one.
I just want to check that 250 corflutes doesn't include ones on private property. It's just the public ones.
It's just public unleased land.
250 plus.
Correct. Correct. Yeah, public unleased land is the limit you can have them. But the 100-metre rule does apply to signs within 100 metres of the building, even if it's on private land.
The building meaning the polling place.
The polling place in which the building in which polling is taking place. Okay, so we'll start back to cover information about early voting. Significant changes have been introduced since the last election relating to early voting. Early voting is increasingly popular, and the ACT has very high numbers of electors wishing to vote at a time that is convenient to them. In the ACT, the early voting period had always been across a 3-week period. However, this has now changed. Attendance voting, that is voting in person at an early voting centre, is now only available over a 2-week period. And in 2024, because the Monday, 2 weeks out from election day, is a public holiday, early voting won't commence until Tuesday, the 8th of October. So during that 2-week period, starting 8 October, we will have at least 2 early voting centres in each of the 5 electorates across the ACT. We're working towards more, but there are great challenges in identifying appropriate and suitable locations, and we'll release the exact locations earlier, closer to the election date. But like in earlier elections, the centres will be located in 5 main business districts in the ACT. So Gungahlin Town Centre, Belconnen, the City, Woden and Tuggeranong. And then also in some of the smaller business districts like Kippax, Western Creek and Lanyon. The final locations of these voting centres will of course be advertised on our website, but they will also be communicated through a household brochure that will be delivered to every household just prior to the commencement of voting. The other significant change to early voting is that there is no longer a requirement to have a reason to vote prior to election day. Early voting is now available to all ACT electors. And as has always been the case, electors can vote at any one of the early voting centres that will be located across the ACT. They can vote wherever is easiest for them. Postal voting, however, remains at 3 weeks, and that provides extra time for voters to be sent out and return their postal votes in time. Postal voting, therefore, commences on the 30th of September and is available to anyone who won't be able to attend an early voting centre or a polling place on election day. While the facility to apply for a postal vote will become live in coming days on the Elections ACT website, Elections ACT, of course, cannot dispatch postal votes until after the nomination of candidates is declared and the ballot papers are produced. So the earliest that postal votes can be mailed to electors is the 30th of September. So on to authorisation. Essentially, with a number of small exceptions, anything that is considered electoral matter requires the inclusion of an authorisation statement. So what is electoral matter? It's matter either in printed or electronic form that is intended or likely to affect voting at an election. The Act then goes on to provide some broad examples of when that may be the case. So matter is taken to be intended or likely to affect voting at an election if it contains a reference to or comment on the performance of a political entity. So that might be the performance of the ACT government, candidate, a political party, an MLA, or the opposition. Or if the material contains reference to an issue that is before electors at the election. So most campaign material will fall under the definition of electoral matter and therefore requires an authorisation statement. So why does electoral matter matter? And it matters for 2 reasons. It appears within the Electoral Act definition of electoral expenditure and therefore critical to the calculations of a participant's electoral expenditure cap. And we'll get onto that bit a little bit later. And it appears in the legislation when discussing the dissemination of electoral matter, particularly in terms of the need to have an authorisation statement. So participants in the ACT, whether they're a candidate, party secretary or a third-party campaigner, are required to appropriately authorise all the electoral matter they produce and disseminate. Although, as previously noted, there are a small number of exceptions, and I would recommend reading our fact sheet for a full understanding. But to give a very quick idea, it's things like letters to the editor and campaign novelties like T-shirts, badges and business cards that don't require an authorisation statement, but very limited exceptions. And what we say is, when in doubt, include a statement. It just ensures that you aren't at risk of non-compliance, and if you want to help us out, and it'll greatly reduce the complaints that we receive. It's worth noting that the inclusion of an authorisation statement itself doesn't mean that something is definitely a electoral matter, and therefore the costs of producing it counting towards the expenditure cap. If it's not electoral matter, it's not electoral matter. But the inclusion of an authorisation statement enhances the transparency and trust throughout. So in our view, it's always a good thing. So a compliant authorisation statement consists of 3 elements. The first and last name of the person who authorised or authored a statement that the person authorised the matter, and a statement that the matter is published on behalf of the related party or candidate or third party. So a compliant example would be something like authorised by John Brown, candidate for Yerrabee, or authorised by Susan Black on behalf of the Purple Party, or authorised by Kevin Purple for Citizens Against Pastels. And there are some other examples up there. It's also important to understand that authorisation statements must be included on electoral matter at all times. It isn't just a requirement during an ACT election campaign. Following the election campaign, any electoral matter will also continue to need an authorisation statement. So a number of amendments were recently passed in the Assembly to provide greater clarity on how an authorisation must be included in published material. The changes can be categorised as amendments on the form of the statement and also amendments to the language requirements. So form and access requirements. When the product is audio only, the statement is to be communicated in speech. When the product is audio-visual in nature, the statement is to be communicated in both text and in speech. And when the product is in print, the statement must be in text that cannot be removed or erased under normal use. In any electoral matter where the statement must be in text, text must be reasonably prominent, legible at a distance that the matter is intended to be viewed from, in a colour that contrasts with the background. That's something that we found in 2020. People were, or parties or candidates were placing authorisation statements on a background in a very similar colour to the font, and it made it very difficult to identify for electors. And we received quite a few complaints about that. So the laws are now changed in a colour that contrasts with the background. And it also must not be placed over complex images or multicoloured backgrounds. Additionally, for electoral matter disseminated using a web page, it must appear in the web page footer. And the matter disseminated through social media in a reasonably prominent place on the social media account. Generally, we recommend in the About section of the social media account, or potentially embedded within the profile image. Users just need to be able to reasonably identify the statement on a social media account. It's then not necessary to authorise every tweet or post generated by the page, as long as it can be identified within the account itself. And there are also new requirements to include the statement in a language of the target audience. So when a statement is required, it must appear in English. But if the matter is published in a language other than English, the statement must appear in English and that other language. So I'll pause again and just to see if there's any other questions lodged. Nothing online in the audience. No, we can push on. It's be very comprehensive. Okay, so onto the other reason why electoral matter matters, electoral expenditure. So the definition of electoral expenditure is expenditure incurred on producing, broadcasting, publishing, displaying or distributing any electoral matter, as well as expenditure incurred on consultants or advertising agent fees and opinion polling or other electoral research. Electoral expenditure does not include administrative expenditure. So for example, ongoing staff costs or office rent are not considered electoral expenditure. If in doubt though, just give us a call and we'd be happy to provide advice. One of the key elements of electoral expenditure is that the costs are incurred when the service or product is provided or delivered, not necessarily when the invoice was issued or paid. For example, if an advertisement was produced and paid for in 2023, but the advertisement is distributed during the key election period in 2024, then the costs of production and distribution are considered electoral expenditure for inclusion within the cap because the ad was delivered during the capped expenditure period, which I'll get onto shortly. The same applies for campaign material that was produced for a previous election. It isn't uncommon for a party that contested one election to wish to reuse things like corflute signs again at the following election. This is great in terms of sustainability, but it needs to be noted that if the material is reused for this election, the full costs are attributed to the 2024 election expenditure cap. Depreciation and amortization of the material is not accounted for under the legislation. And this really goes to the heart of the intent of the expenditure cap. It is designed to provide a level playing field for all participants. If the party was able to reuse materials from a previous election without incurring the costs for the current election, then it would provide an unfair advantage to parties and candidates that have run before. So the expenditure cap is a limit on the amount of money that can be spent on an ACT election campaign. And for the 2024 election, the expenditure cap is $50,135. This is the same expenditure cap amount that applies across the board to non-party candidates, associated entities, and third-party campaigners. For a registered political party, the cap is the same amount, but it's per candidate contesting the election on behalf of the party. So for a party running the full 5 candidates in each of the 5 electorates, so 25 in total, the expenditure cap for the party grouping is $50,135 times 25 candidates. But registered parties need to understand that while it is calculated by multiplying the cap amount by the number of candidates contesting the election on behalf of the party, it doesn't mean that each candidate only has the cap amount to spend. Some candidates can spend more than the cap, but that would mean other candidates must spend less than the cap. It is the entire party grouping that has that cap, not the individual candidates or MLAs within it. So the expenditure cap period runs from the 1st of January in an election year until the end of polling day, the 19th of October. And political entities must then report their electoral expenditure through an election return, which is due 60 days after the election. There are significant penalties for an entity that breaches their expenditure cap. For every dollar an entity spends over the cap, it is liable to pay $2 to the territory, so twice the amount of the overspend. And finally, a change introduced since the last election provides for an exemption from the expenditure cap, up to 12.5% of the cap, for electoral expenditure spent on translation services. This was introduced to incentivise the translation of electoral matter into languages other than English. So just over $6,000 can be incurred on translation services, which will not need to be counted when calculating your expenditure for the election. The spreadsheet that we produce to assist in lodging election returns helps with the calculating of this exemption. So moving on to other financial disclosure matters. If you intend to participate in this election, you must be aware of your gift reporting obligations, particularly the timing, which is now quite frequent. So the threshold for disclosing the details of gifts received is $1,000. The amount is important because if a series of gifts received from the same donor and each valued at under $1,000 are received in a financial year, they do not need to be reported to the Commission until the total value of the gifts received reaches that $1,000 threshold. Now, obviously, we've just begun a new financial year, so the calculations have all been reset as of the 1st of July. So let's say on the 1st of July, you received a gift from Joe's Printing Services of $550. And then on the 10th of August, you received some free printing services from Joe's Printing Services of $500, which we would call a gift in kind. That's the free services. Then Joe has now gifted to you a total value of over $1,000, and this triggers the reporting obligations. Regular gift returns are now required to be lodged within 7 days of the total amount received from the same person or organisation reaching that $1,000 threshold. And to add to this, once a donor reaches that $1,000 gift threshold, all future gifts of any value must be disclosed within 7 days of receipt until the end of the financial year. So in that example, the second gift, the free services, it was received on the 10th of August. So the obligation for disclosure is to detail both gifts received by the 17th of August. It isn't reporting one transaction of $1,050 from Joe's Printing Service, it's reporting both transactions that the total above that threshold. Gift returns must be lodged by registered political parties, associated entities, and non-party candidates. Party candidates do not need to lodge candidate-specific gift returns, but they do need to keep their party up to date with the gifts that they receive so that the party to which they belong can meet the gift reporting obligations. While third-party campaigners do not need to lodge gift returns, they do need to report their gifts received in their post-election return. I strongly recommend visiting our website and engaging with our FAQ information and handbooks to gain a full understanding of gift reporting. So obviously, gift reporting relies quite heavily on what is defined as a gift. While the wording of the Act can be a little confusing, really, a gift is the giving of money without the expectation of receiving anything in return. And it's the giving of services without the expectation of receiving anything in return. These are known as gifts in kind. An example of a gift in kind might be the provision of legal advice from a solicitor, free of charge, or the provision of an artwork for use as part of a fundraising auction. When reporting gifts in kind, the ascertained value of the gifts in kind must be disclosed, along with details of how such a value was derived. And just to round out the definition of gift, it's also the part of party membership fees that are more than $250. If party membership fees are less than $250, they're considered a receipt, not a gift. If they're $251, then a gift of $1 is the amount. So for good and compliant disclosure, accurate recording is essential. Things like who specifically made the donation. Was it the CEO of the organisation personally, or was it the organisation? Entities must maintain a minimum standard of record keeping that allows the entity to disclose appropriately. This means recording the date that gifts are received, the amount of the gift, the details of the person who gave the gift, such as the name and address of the person or organisation. And if the gift is a gift in kind, the estimated value of the gift and how that value was derived. For political parties, the default individual with responsibility for the lodgement of disclosure returns, it lies with the registered officer. However, a party can appoint a reporting agent to take responsibility for all financial disclosure matters. In fact, new legislation now provides for the appointment of up to 2 reporting agents if the party chooses. And I'll just pause again to see if there's any questions. None lodged. Anything in the audience? We've got a couple. Fiona?
Is there the gifts register on the Elections ACT website yet?
Of disclosed gifts?
Yeah.
Yes. So that's continually maintained. So any gift disclosed up to this point is available. Yes.
The $1,000 limit is reset from 1st of July. And do you recommend making a disclosure every week? You know, we're doing the monthly disclosures, and sometimes submitting one even if there were no donations. Would you recommend doing that as a weekly disclosure from here on out?
I think it just depends on how the party or the non-party candidate wishes to maintain their own financial records. If it was me, I would be putting every gift into the gift disclosure spreadsheet that we make available, and doing that. If it was me, I'd do it at least twice a week. If it's a nil return, if you haven't got any gifts, you don't need to respond. You don't need to disclose. But the danger of doing it once a week is that if you receive a gift on Monday and you disclose on Tuesdays, there is the risk that Monday one if you miss it by a day or something like that. So a nice and regular is how I would be doing it, but this is new to us as well. So we're learning on what parties and candidates works best for them. So I think you just have to work that out for yourself. But I would be trying to do it as regularly as possible, just to make it so you're not falling foul of those 7-day very tight timelines.
Thank you.
Roads, strips on the slides. Could you just remind the attendees of the arrangements with respect to the Commonwealth Amendments Act, whereby you can make declarations, gifts, donations to the federal entity?
Yeah, so Damien's talking about the impact of Commonwealth legislation on the ACT's funding and disclosure regime. That mean that if a party or a candidate or a political entity receives a gift that they don't want to disclose to the ACT Electoral Commission, they need to immediately put it into an account that is a federal election account. This is for parties that have registration at both those levels, at the federal level and in the ACT. And then that money must then be used for a federal purpose. It can't be used for an ACT election, and it can't be moved out of that account and into use for an ACT purpose. And there are fairly significant issues involved if that was to be the case. It would expose all those gifts, all that money, to ACT legislation. Yes, Gil?
Ron, the legislation you're referring to, Commonwealth legislation, is that the Commonwealth Electoral Act 1980?
I think it's 1980, but it's the Commonwealth Electoral Act.
1980. That constrains you.
That
Constrains you in a lot of things. You know, I was waiting all along this time for you to make reference to that legislation.
a lot of impact of the Commonwealth legislation on the House, but that is one particular.
Anyway, I got no problem with all the secondary issues and, you know, but the essence of one's identity, etc., is not negotiable. And I think you are restrained under that act. And the freedom to give us access to the electoral roll, that is another thing. I think I haven't read it. Only last night I had a look at the index. And
the Commonwealth Electoral Act doesn't play a large role in ACT elections. That is one particular case where it does. I'll just move on to Peter.
Yeah, by the way, this is great. We didn't expect to get so much information and assistance as we went. And I know you'll get us if we get it wrong, by the way. I know that. But the grey areas, I ring up my brother, he's a lawyer, and I ask him questions, as you do. And he says something and it has an impact. I mean, my brother's not a lawyer, by the way, so I won't. But do you declare sort of those sorts of things? Like there's lots of those conversations go on.
If it is a service that would normally be paid for, but you are receiving it without charge, then it would be considered a gift in kind.
Because normally in families, they don't charge it. Unless, hopefully they don't. And we'll never get to 50 grand anyway, so thank you. No, that's those grey areas. Thank you.
Okay, so moving on to prohibited donors. We've had prohibited donors in the ACT since 2021. However, relatively recent amendments have now introduced an additional category of prohibited donor. In the ACT, it's prohibited for a political entity to accept a gift from a property developer, a close associate of a property developer, a foreign entity, which is the newly added category, or a person acting on behalf of a property developer, a close associate of a property developer, or a foreign entity. It is also prohibited for the same entities to give the gift to a political entity. The ban applies to all gifts of any value. However, the penalties for a breach do vary dependent on the value of the gift received. So where the gift is given or received and the value is less than $250, the giver and the receiver must pay to the territory an amount equal to the amount of the gift. But where the gift has a value of $250 or more, a criminal offence is committed with penalties up to 6 months in prison and or fines of up to $8,000 for an individual or $40,500 for a corporation. So, of course, much depends on the legislated definition of these prohibited donors. I went through the definitions of property developer and close associate of a property developer in an earlier public briefing. And for the sake of brevity, I'm not going to go over that again here. But we do have specific information on those matters on our website, and it's worth reviewing if you have concerns or questions. However, as foreign entities is the new category of prohibited donor for this election, I've included the definitions here. So a foreign entity means an entity that is not one or more of the following: an individual who is an Australian citizen, an individual whose principal place of residence is in Australia, a company incorporated under the Corporations Act, a company incorporated under a territory law, an entity which has its head office located in Australia, an entity for which the principal place of activity is in Australia, and a body politic or part of a body politic of Commonwealth and Territory or state. But a political entity can protect itself from serious breaches of the prohibited donor legislation if they take what are called reasonable steps to ensure that the person giving the gift is not a prohibited donor. And the Act does provide some guidance on what may be considered a reasonable step. So the giving potential donors written notice that donations from property developers, close associates of property developers and foreign entities are prohibited, or asking the person who is giving the gift whether the person or the people associated with the gift are prohibited donors, or obtaining a declaration from the person who gives the gift that the person is not a prohibited donor. This applies to all prohibited donors. So I'd recommend to any entity that has already put reasonable steps in place to protect them against the receipt of gifts from property developers to review those reasonable steps and adjust to ensure that foreign entities are also detailed and taken into account. So moving on to disclosure compliance audits. Anyone familiar with the ACT's campaign finance regulations will know that the Electoral Commission is empowered to issue investigation notices to examine the financial records of any political entity. The Commission has for a long time conducted compliance reviews of political entities in relation to gift disclosures, the use of administration funding and electoral expenditure. This long-standing compliance program seeks to ensure that disclosed details are consistent with the financial records of the entity. An audit is conducted on those records and discrepancies are publicly reported. In some circumstances, infringement notices and penalties may be issued for late or incomplete or inaccurate disclosures. Older parties and experienced candidates will know this, but for new parties and candidates looking to contest this upcoming ACT election, we will be seeking to look at your financial records. So keep on top of your record keeping and ensure that you're disclosing the elements that need to be disclosed. So those types of audits have been in place for a long time, but with the introduction of prohibited donor legislation, we needed to expand our compliance enforcement program. So the Commission now also conducts compliance audits to ensure that the gifts being received are not being received from property developers or foreign entities. Again, discrepancies are made public and there is potential for criminal charges. So we're getting towards the end of this briefing and we've been through a number of recent and significant changes to the legislation and in quite an amount of detail. But there are also some further legislative amendments that I think are worth briefly mentioning here. The number of candidates that can be nominated by a party is now limited to the number of members who can be elected for that electorate. Previously, there was the option for a party to run more candidates than there were seats. This ability was technically available, although no party ever took that opportunity. It is now legislatively limited to 5 per electorate. And the register of political parties now includes the name and address of the party secretary. Accordingly, there's now a requirement for parties to formally apply to change their party secretary in much the same way as they always needed to when applying to change the registered officer. It's important that evidence is provided at the time of the application that demonstrates that the change to party secretary was made in accordance with the party's constitution. Party secretary has some fairly powerful abilities within the Electoral Act, so we need demonstrated evidence that it is the person who you say it is. And Elections ACT is now empowered to provide mobile polling services in locations where people experiencing homelessness are likely to attend. I also wish to share some important resources in relation to your ongoing engagements with the community. The eSafety Commissioner is Australia's independent regulator on online safety. eSafety also provides advice for managing the impacts of adult cyber abuse. Adult cyber abuse is when the internet is used to send, post or share content that is harmful to the physical or mental health of someone who is 18 or older. It is possible as you go about your community engagement activities that you experience cyber abuse. Anyone who needs support should visit esafety.gov.au for information, education and other resources. There are also a number of other resources listed on the screen now to assist should you need them. And further to this, the ACT government is proposing to host a forum for female identifying candidates to address gender-based harassment experienced by female candidates. The Electoral Commission will circulate the details of this forum to parties and candidates when they've been confirmed. Okay, well, we've reached the end of the presentation today. I hope that was useful and informative. We've covered a great deal of detail and much of it was complex. To ensure that you're meeting your obligations, we recommend using any of these links on the screen for accessing further information. We're always available to answer your questions and to provide advice. We highly recommend downloading the 2024 Candidate Information Handbook if you haven't already. We've got a couple of copies here today as well. Also, if you'd like to provide feedback on the content or the delivery of this briefing, we'd welcome your thoughts so that we meet our client needs as best as we can. I'll just check the chat function one last time to see if there's any lodged.
If anybody has any questions in the chat, please use the chat function to ask them.
Anything in the crowd? Gil?
Yeah. Ron, I would like to publicly thank for the fountain of knowledge you have given me. And I intend tapping again because it's better than me doing all that. Ron, in the legislation, Commonwealth legislation, there's constant reference to registrar. What are they talking about?
Commonwealth legislation?
Yeah.
No idea. It's not our act, so it's irrelevant to this election.
So, yeah, one quick thing I meant to ask you before. A couple of people are going to be overseas that I know, and they were saying they're finding it difficult to work out how to vote. If they're leaving now and they'll be away quite a while.
So the application for a postal vote will go live on our website in coming days.
Said before. Oh, okay.
Very, very shortly. But like I said, we can't send those to an elector until the 30th of September. But at this election, because the timeframes for receipt and then return of postal votes are 3 weeks, well, 4 weeks in total. And postal services are just not meeting those services as well as they were. So this election will be door-to-door couriering overseas postal votes. And they can return them in the same manner. So
embassies aren't part of the...
Not for state or territory elections. That's
and just an observation, with the address of the party secretaries, etc., I noticed that and I thought, gee, you know, if we come out and condemn a criminal organisation, I mean, they could get your address anyway. It's not as though you can hide it these days, but I thought, gee, that publication of someone's address...
So it doesn't have to be your enrolled address.
Yeah, PO box.
So it can't be a PO box, but it can be a business address or the party's headquarter address. Can't be a PO box.
It's a tricky one.
Yeah, it is a tricky one, eh?
Rowan, I got the impression, and I haven't read the act, that I'm entitled under that act, which I think constrains you. Under that act, I'm entitled to a copy of the electoral roll.
So I've already spoken to you about this, Gil. So registered political parties can get one. You're not a registered political party. Candidates can get one, but you're not a declared candidate yet. And you can't get one until you are a declared candidate. Under the Commonwealth Act, I'm sure of what their rules are. It's not our act. You could talk to them if you wanted. But under our act, registered political parties and declared candidates.
So, Ron, I got the impression that as I said last night, is the only time I've read it and looked at the index, that you can't restrain comes under that. Anyway, I would like to get it before the 12th. I can't nominate before the 12th as a candidate before the 12th, but if you can't, it's an issue that I should let it go. Anyway, you'll give one after After you
an
nominate
extract of
the
the
candidate.
on request
Okay,
as
fair.
a declared candidate.
I'll give it.
Any questions? Any further questions in the audience? So that brings this this presentation to a conclusion. But as I mentioned earlier, at 12:30 we'll have a second briefing, which will be specifically on misleading electoral advertising and the application of those new rules. So I'd like to thank everyone for attending today. I hope it was useful.